right, so let's talk about prescription and resistance training, and specifically exercise selection. What exercises are the best? There's so many choices out there. There's so many fancy, sexy things out there that look really cool, but maybe for you, it's not really optimal. And how do we know that? Well, we know where our clients sit based on first assessing and determining their movement function. And we do that through our primal pattern movement screen, and look for in those patterns any lack of mobility, any lack of stability, and that way we can improve the mobility and stability in the joint that supports that particular pattern. And then over time, once they close the gap of that dysfunction, we can now start working towards fitness. And what I mean by fitness is just adding more load, more volume over time to increase capacity. So let's go ahead and use an example. Today we're going to talk about the overhead press. And for any of you who use an exercise such as a dumbbell, barbell, kettlebell, and you're working overhead, we all know that this is a pretty functional exercise. If I'm traveling, I got to put my luggage up and over, up on the shelf, or if I need to reach up in the garage and grab something, right? So we're always using that function, right? But where do we see pain? Where do we see limitation or just lack of strength there? That's what we want to determine. Where is that happening in the shoulder itself? So we're not just like bypassing that with a fitness prescription that looks really fun and cool. So in our assessments for overhead pressing, we look at internal, external rotation of the shoulder. Does the client have that basic function so without pain, so we can start progressing them in that way for an overhead strength and performance kind of dynamic. So what we do is we look at, for example, we can use the scratch test, which is what this is here. So I'm taking one hand and reaching out behind my back, looking at as much vertical alignment as I can get through the elbow and the shoulder, and then the other one's going up and around the backside to look at that internal rotation. And as we alternate from front to back, is there any deferring pain? Is there any limitation in the mobility to do that? And the red flags for anyone who wants to press overhead, if I don't have the mobility, and so I'm really stuck here, right? So the elbow is pointing forward as opposed to pointing vertically up, or I'm hypercompensating through my thoracic spine to try to get extension. So if I told a client to squeeze their butt and pack their rib cage, and then they're back to this capacity, right, where again we're lacking mobility, then we probably don't want to start with an overhead press or a dumbbell over a press for that client because they don't have the function yet in that joint. So we want to give a client a little bit more confidence in overhead positioning and kind of rewire that function again by using some isometric exercises that will start lengthening the tissues and also creating tension over time to support the stability. And once the brain knows there's stability in that joint, usually the tissues will free up and it will allow the arm to reach in its normal capacity as opposed to a limited capacity. So some things that I like to look at in a prescription for a client who wants to build overhead function is having them hang passively first on a bar. So can I get them to hang passively on the bar, start lengthening and stretching the tissues, and then once we get them on the bar passively and that feels safe and that feels good, there's no pain there, then we can start actively, boom, that means I'm going to pull that scap down only through the shoulder joint, not through my elbow, right? Just kind of get used to using the shoulder and sliding it vertically and depress it down to the ground and start building again that isometric strength in the shoulder joint by doing just a passive hang and then an active hang. So starting that progression. So to me, that progression to get overhead function is just an example of where you'd want to start before picking up a couple dumbbells and trying to go overhead and still having to use like your cervical spine, your upper trap, and then which leads to impingements and then more rotator dysfunction down the road, which will lead to more long-term pain. So there's just an example of how we work through progressing function back into an athlete or a client, and why it's important to first know where you sit right now for your functional patterns, and how do we clean it up so we can get you as competent in all the ways to train that suit your goals, your lifestyle, and your needs.